New Haven's home for community radio, where we look at the stories behind the headlines. Jaywan Carter's already checked in on Facebook. Good morning, Jaywan. Thanks for watching us and listening to us. Boy, I have a fun show. At least for me, I have a fun show. We'll see if you folks agree today. We're going to talk about these pandemic times as seen through one of New Haven's most gifted writers, a news reporter who decided to cover the pandemic not through prose, but through poetry as another way to get at how this is affecting our lives, how this moment in history is changing us or affecting us as human beings and as souls. His name is Alan Appel. He is a staff writer for the New Haven Independent. He's a playwright. He's a poet. He's my friend. And Alan, thanks for coming on the air because you're going to read some of your poems today and we're going to talk about them, about the pandemic. Thanks for coming on, Alan.
Well, my pleasure, Paul. Thank you. And I believe I am writing some prose. I am doing some stories. And, one of the interesting things for me is to cover a management team meeting and, do a news piece on that. And then the next morning kind of try to cover the territory. Yeah, just it's interesting. I mean, I think of these poems as a kind of reportage.
I agree with you, Alan. Also, and one thing I've always loved about your reporting is that because you have a background and you continue to work as a playwright and a poet, as well as a terrific news reporter, you can switch hit. So once in a while, it makes more sense to write. Most of the time, you write your stories as straight ahead, momish news stories, and then other times it makes sense to take it more of the view a playwright would. Or in these times, how did you get started? We've published 22 and counting of your poems. How did you get started writing poems about the pandemic?
It's a bit of a mystery to me. I just I don't know. I mean, I think that especially in the harrowing days in the beginning in March, early March, which I think is when the poems date from, I found myself getting up early in the morning. And I'm an early riser, but I don't usually get up at 5:15 or 5:30. But I was getting up and grabbing the notebook, and it's a kind of throwback to 30 or 40 years ago when I was, much younger, and it just had an impulse to, as I think a lot of people do, to try to figure things out or express myself, but it's just, or maybe just to have some time to center and to figure things out. People have different things they do. Sometimes I think of writing poetry as a form of meditation or exercise, but it helps me.
I believe that creative inspiration isn't something you can explain. So when Bob Dylan wrote Like a Rolling Stone and the lyrics poured out in like 2 seconds and he set the piano and there were the chords, or your song, Elton John. I mean, writers, musicians, poets, they always talk about how all of a sudden something hit them and everything just flowed out. It wasn't a sense of like having a meeting at a publishing house and saying, now we need to find a poet, or an editorial meeting. We say, how are we going to cover this story? One gets inspired, and without getting too woo-woo, I do believe that there's a universal consciousness that artists tap into that we don't understand that inspires them. So some people call it divine inspiration. I just think that's another name for inspiration that connects us to something larger than ourselves and can't be explained by human understanding. How's that?
Well, that's pretty good. And but another, yes, I think it, and it does sound woo woo, and it does sometimes make the practice of poetry seem like a very a kind of effete enterprise or something, or difficult. But it is a lot like just being open to kind of catching the bird in the backyard or seeing it.
Right, because you talk about how it sounds effete, but in truth, the great poetry, like the great reporting, is completely accessible, completely down to earth and visual. Right. It is capturing the bird in the backyard, or it's Mary Oliver looking at nature and thinking what her life's about. It's about Allen Ginsberg saying cottage for his mother, and it's about Alan Appel writing pandemic poems that I I feel so honored to be publishing in the independent people and following along with them, thinking about how it connects to their own lives, about people they see passing. And it's been illustrated by Ted Little for his cartoons, which I also really love. So, Alan, tonight, Thursday night, begins the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, which
Right.
commemorates a bunch of things that we don't really understand why, including eating dairy. But it also commemorates the giving of the Ten Commandments. One of
Right.
your, part of what your Pandemic poems have done, they've looked at the sadness, the trying to figure out the confusion, the whimsy, or the day-to-day life changes in the pandemic. So you said, here's this holiday coming where we learn about the Ten Commandments, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. And you wrote a pandemic poem called Thou Shalt. Alan Appel, would you read that for
Right.
us?
Yeah.
Thou Shalt by Alan Appel.
In a couple of days comes the holiday that Christians call Pentecost and Jews Shavuot. The Ten Commandments will be given again. Don't do this, do that. Here's how, here's when. Don't infect your mother or your father. Wear a mask, you sons and daughters. I am life, not death. Therefore, murder not your neighbor with your breath, or bear false witness in scientific ignorance. Who keeps distance from the other grows closer to me. These alterations are Sinaitic, permitted in times pandemic. Changes authorized by the powers that be, including you and me. So in this case,
That is
Paul,
a
it
great
wasn't
poem,
so,
and it makes me think of so much. I'm sorry, what say, Alan?
well, what I was going to say was that sometimes poetry is sort of just making yourself open to catch the sight of the bird or the sound in the backyard, and you're a kind of a receiver of other people's stuff. In this case, sometimes I think some poetry, especially poetry that tries to, address things that are like the pandemic, you shoehorn together things that don't naturally belong together, and you come up, you there is such a thing in poetry as bringing together as apples and oranges and getting a tangerine or something.
And that's what you did here, really, and it was so meaningful. Immediately a Jewish person can understand, but everybody can understand it, because I think what you did here, Alan, I believe, as a reader, was that you showed us how, while this pandemic's going, we look at what we normally would be doing, and we think about how do we continue doing it under the restrictions. So for Jews, we had Passover right away. All of a sudden, people had Zoom Seders, but a lot of Jews had to figure out, are we allowed to do that? Because you're not supposed to use electronics on the holiday. Then some rabbis got creative and said, well, turn it on before the holiday. And you could even start it before the sundown. But as long as you turn it on, you don't have to turn it off. And in this case, I mean, you've gotten something much more fundamental, which is that we decide to live our lives every day based on ideas that people and our ancestors have wrestled with for centuries. What are the rules we should live by? And Ten Commandments was one version, right? Thou shalt do this and that, don't murder people, don't covet your neighbor. And then we've reinterpreted that, but still tried to use the old words. So you went through the Ten Commandments and looked at how we'll have to apply them during the pandemic. And you ended with talking about it's not just God, if there is a God who we can think of in terms of a creature that gives yeses or nos, which is not how I picture God, but some people do. That's the kind of thing we
Right.
argue about on Shavuot. But you said it's not just God who makes the rules, we do, which is in fact a very deep current of Jewish theological thought, which is
Right.
that the rabbis who hijacked the religion from the mystics a couple of thousand years ago were making a paragraph in order to infuse everyday people with the idea that you do have to act. You can't just say God's going to wave a wand and do everything. You have to reconcile the idea of believing in a force greater than yourself and finding comfort in it. You have to reconcile that idea with individuals have responsibility to take action, which is very much in
That's
Jewish
right.
tradition. I was talking to Jerry Street. Jerry Streets is the Reverend of at New Haven's oldest African American Christian congregation, Dixwell UCC Church, and he's
Right.
talked about having to navigate that during this crisis because there were some fundamentalist religions that said God's going to take care of it. Don't even deal with the pandemic, and then a lot of their parishioners died. And on the
Right.
other hand, the ministers and the rabbis and the imams, they do have to play that role religion plays, which is to give people comfort, to deal with uncertainty, to say, don't freak out. Not every bad scenario is going to happen. When bad things happen, we'll deal with it. There's something greater than us that keeps life going, which is true. We are not all powerful. It's not all up to us, but it's also true that we are responsible and we need to take action to protect each other. It's a very subtle difference that I think your poem, in a very appropriate way for the start of Shavu Ode, succeeded in taking this old debate that's so relevant today and shoving it right into the moment. Alan Appel. And
Mm.
Alan Appel is a staff writer for The Independent, a published poet, not just in The Independent. And he's reading his poems today that he's been writing about the pandemic on Dateline New Haven, WNHHFM live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. So sometimes poets or writers listen to readers or listeners who come up with all sorts of theories about what they meant, which is not like somebody said, I was just writing about the dog walking down the street. I wasn't writing about meteors and the meaning of life, but you found it there. So then there's this whole lit crit school that says, was it there? And does it fine if the reader invents his own meaning? Because that's process of the life of a poem
Mm.
or a song or a novel. Or are we just all wet and you weren't talking about any of the things I was just talking about in that poem?
No, yeah, I loved it. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking maybe we should retitle it "Wear Thy Mask." Uh,
No,
um,
thou shalt is perfect, Alan. That is a title for
right,
the ages.
right.
Now,
So
Alan, you were
who
talking
said God's
earlier.
word? Yeah, go.
Well, what'd you say? No, what'd you say
No,
about
I was
God?
going to say. So who does this quotation come from? God's work on earth must truly be our own. Where does that come from?
I don't know where that comes from.
It floated up to me
That,
as you were talking about
but
being
that's
a
definitely
partner.
the point.
That's the
So, Alan,
point,
you
right?
talked earlier in this about how people can get pretentious and effete about poetry when poetry really is like putting a nail into a board or cooking dinner. You got to actually just do the work in a way that creates something real rather than getting all hoity-toity about it. And the next poem I'm going to ask you to read is a great example of that. We're all trying to figure out how to get our food, and a lot of people are going to Stop and Shop. And like Allen Ginsberg, who had a poem about it, a supermarket in America, is one of my favorite. I forget where it was. I forget the title, but it was one of my favorite poems of Allen Ginsberg.
Supermarket in California.
Yeah, when he was talking about that era of American bountifulness and bounty and consumerism, I believe, but I don't know if that's what the poem was about. But you did a supermarket poem about shopping at a Stop and Shop in New Haven. It's called. Alan, would you read that? Read it for us on Dateline New Haven.
At a Stop and Shop in New Haven. Um, Donning mask, gloves, and baseball cap, like a thief, I go out to shop. No surprise, everyone's dressed just like that. It's kind of fun to see all the robbers by the Cheerios and that gaggle of felons keeping distance by the watermelons. But now in comes a fellow with no gear at all, healthy looking, asymptomatic for sure, and tall. The store grows quiet. Then with a start, the thieves scurry off with their wiped down carts. This man's stride is sure, his smile long and bright. He's the one likely to take your life. You like that last line,
Wow.
Paul. There's a
I
drum
love that.
roll.
Well, I love that a couple of these poems have succeeded in doing something that eludes all of us 99% of the time. Prose, poetry, which is to have an ending. An ending that says, wow, that does fit with the story. It makes you think of the larger point. So
Right.
here you are. What a great poem. That's Alan Appel reading at a Stop and Shop in New Haven. What I loved about it is we're all going shopping and we're all thinking about, are we safe? And we're looking at people, and there's this whole, which I'm not comfortable with, this whole phenomena of chewing out people who aren't taking precautions you wish they would because you're sure they need to. Or on the other hand, people who are so mean to people who think you should take precautions. But what I love about the poetry is what I love about one of the many things I love about you and your writing, which is your humility. You're
Mm.
not someone who goes and tells everybody to do what to think. You're observing and you're thinking about it from a place of humanity. And I feel like you were every shopper in that supermarket. I mean, you
Ah,
told it beautifully in a way that few people can by talking about the felons and the thieves. And usually, I'm a supermarket and I take a minute and I say, wait, is this not one of those stories about the people who stole the cabbages and the beers from the supermarket? No, that's the way we're starting to look at each other. You showed it
yeah.
so beautifully, Howard. That is a great, and I love these are tight, short poems that capture how we're living and how we're struggling to make sense, continue some semblance life we had while changing with the times during
I
pandemic
believe,
of
yes.
COVID-19.
I love your finding so much in really what just a few lines. And I think when we're surrounded by all this love and all this death, and we feel these impulses. They're all out there. You don't need a lot of lines. You don't need a lot of words. You just have to uh, to tap the right keys, and it resonates. I mean, I for example think shopping, certainly in the beginning of the pandemic, was full of real low key terror for a lot of people. I
It still
certainly
is.
experienced that, and maybe still is. Yeah,
We go to Stop and I mean, we go to Edge of the Woods, and my sister and I try to time it for when there won't be as many people there because even though the people there are great, they're very cool. They were in the mask trying to keep apart. You can't be
right,
6 feet apart in the produce aisle of Edge of the Woods if there's one other individual.
right.
So yeah, I think that is an Alan and Esther writes in good. Thanks, Esther, for listening to Dateline New Haven, 103.5 FM live streamed at newhaven.org with Alan Appel, who's reading his pandemic poems for the COVID-19 era. Why don't we skip one ahead, Alan, if that's okay?
Oh,
Um,
sure.
you talk about the terror, you talk because what I loved is I wanted to get a mix here. I felt like a DJ with a playlist of greatest hits albums and try to put them in some kind of order. And I was trying to go back and forth from what would otherwise be mundane, like going shopping and our tasks, to and going with your Stop and Shop and going to how we're thinking about age-old questions of religion and our rituals and how we make them change with COVID. But let's go to something the heavy, because some of it's heavy. And I know our readers had this reaction too about when someone might have it. So I was going to ask you to read a poem called "Don't Die, Stanley." Do you have that one up? You Alan Appel
Yes.
reading "Don't Die, Stanley."
So, Paul, this is different from most of the others. This is a kind of story, a story poem, which certainly has its place. Don't die, Stanley. I was going to write that note to my friend Stanley and all my friends, and even acquaintances of a certain age and members of our vulnerable group. I wanted to express how much I would miss them if the plague carried them away. But then I thought, would I send such a note on an ordinary day in an ordinary time, a spring without body counts and gowns and vents? And as the answer was no, Stanley might think my words were just irritatingly cute, a way to get attention to myself with the sad display of flat foot of irony to boot. And he'd probably be right. Plus, the note might actually make him think about dying, which he likely wasn't doing, because he's just a very busy, basically healthy guy who hasn't been in touch with me for a while, a terse, no nonsense, uncute, nothing fancy, grounded kind of man, which is particularly what I like about him. Yet I thought also, perhaps I really don't love Stanley as much as I think I do. And I've required the specter of death, of COVID-19, to create this odd inventory of those I would miss, my COVID-19 team. And surely this disqualifies my emotion, doesn't it? Making it more of a selfish notion than true love and affection expressed. So I didn't send my note to Stanley, not yet, or to anyone else on my list. And these days have gone on, and I write or Skype or talk to others, in my family, of course, but not to Stanley or to the others whom I thought I loved and would miss. But then a mutual friend died, someone I knew only because of him, and it was Stanley who emailed me news of her death. Franny, he wrote, after 2 weeks in the hospital. Tears. That was Stanley, always terse Stanley. Had a baby been born, his message would have been easy labor. Cheers. But this gave me an opportunity to reply. without the unprompted awkwardness of the note I tried. So I began writing the usual things about how I miss her, which, truth be told, was not quite true, because unfortunately she was not on my list, although she could have been, I suppose, technically, because I don't want anyone to die. But I just didn't feel John Donnish about her, that I'm supposed to be an island and everyone's death diminishes me, although it all depends on what you mean by diminish. And as I was thinking all this while replying to him, I never finished even that note to Stanley the way I'd wanted. Instead, I sent it off with one banal salutation or another, like thanks for the sad news and hugs, or as we say these days, stay safe and be healthy. But then that night, I dreamed Stanley came down with a terrible cough, and it lasted 3 weeks, and he couldn't find a place for a test. And he said it was okay because he didn't want to go to a hospital anyway, because they can't do anything for you. And he kept coughing so loudly in my dream, it woke me up. And that's why I'm writing this. And as soon as I finish, I'm going to write to him, really this time. Or maybe I'll call, or better yet, put on my mask and drive over there and throw a pebble at his window. I'll keep throwing it until I get him out of bed. And this could be part of the dream or not. What does it matter? Because when he raises the window, I'm going to yell, I'm going to cry from 6 feet away, of course. I'll shout, don't die, Stanley. Please don't die.
Wow. Don't Die, Stanley. One of the great poems written by Alan Appel during this COVID-19 pandemic. He's reading them, we're discussing them on Dateline New Haven, WNHHFM. And as typical with your work, it has this great combination of insight, seriousness, humor, and whimsy, and perspective on yourself. So we can all relate to how we struggle with what do we say to someone who we may or may not lose. And I've had that same thing, like, am I being phony about someone I'm not really that close to? Like, this calls into
Yeah.
question, what are our relationships? I love two of the terse comments that people posted on this. Two of my favorite commenters. 1644 wrote, I never wrote that note to Al. He had a cough. Then they said he was getting better. We agreed he was a tough old bird. Now he is gone. Write the note to Stanley.
Yes, that was wonderful.
Wow. Patricia Kane wrote, why is it so hard to let people know you love them while they're still here to appreciate the connection? Alan, what made that a poem as opposed to prose?
Well,
It wasn't Moon June. It wasn't iambic pentameter.
no, there are some rhymes in there, but they don't. And you kind of hear them when you read it silently, but when you read it aloud, what moves you along is the story, the what's going to happen next quality. And there is, I used to teach English to different kids and young adults in college, high school, and there is such a thing as a narrative poem where the plot carries you forward, and the kind of rhythms of the language are
like the Odyssey.
They're the more the background music. That's right. But there is a what happened next quality that you get in this particular one, whereas most of the other pandemic poems that we've published in the paper they're more lyric. They more capture not something that goes through time, but
going
a
deep
moment.
In a moment. Should I write a note to Stanley as yeah, I got it. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this could have been done in 6 or 7 lines as a kind of a lyric, as a moment. But I just kind of like the idea of running to somebody's window and throwing a pebble, which is a pretty poetical thing to do, I think.
And you were reporting, which is why it's in the New Haven Independent. You were reporting, it's like in the supermarket, you're reporting out what's going through your head. You were talking about, this was a news article about Alan Appel decides whether or not to write a note to Stanley. It was written as a poem, very appropriate. Right. Alan, you published a book of poetry. What was it called and when was it published?
Oh, well, but before prose and before journalism, I published, back in 1974, I published a little poetry, 1975, I think, a poetry book called New Listings, which I thought one of the best things about that book was that it always reminded me of the telephone book and also what happens to a ship when it founders. It lists.
Oh yeah.
So it was new listings. And then I did another poetry book in the 80s called Not So Much Love of Flowers. And then
And you also
that,
written many novels. I'm a big fan. The way I met you was that I love your novels, and I've loved every single one of them. How many novels have you written?
I don't know, 8 or 9,
And you've gotten published, and you've written plays. I've seen them performed,
written
including
some
about
plays
New
too.
Haven. And
Yeah.
Alan, you is it fair to say that your typical work schedule includes some hours a day writing news articles for the New Haven Independent,
Hmm.
some articles, some hours a day working on a play or a novel, and then occasionally doing some poetry, which is
Right.
really interesting. How do you how do you pivot? How do you get in the frame of mind of writing? I know you're very organized. You know, you set up a structure, but you can't totally do that because sometimes I send you out in the middle of the night to cover something, and sometimes in the middle of the afternoon or the morning. But how do you change your frame of mind in the course of a day to write in so many different ways?
Well, by and large, the richest vein to mind for me is what happens when I get up from sleep. So early in the morning is poetry, and if I'm able to, to catch one, as we talked about earlier, um,
Yeah.
then the poet, then the best part of my day is sort of in the bag, and I'm happy to go out into the world of prose and reportage. So that's really what makes it work for me. It's like, I think on some level, it's like, people wanting to get out, and if they can get their exercise in, or their mile, or their meditation, or their workout. But for me, to be able to kind of write from that zone, sort of still close to sleep and dreams, but also awake. If I can get something going, and I do the poetry, then the other stuff is very, the prose, and especially playwriting. That's very much more like craftsmanship. You know how we work on our stories in the Independent. What's the beginning? What's the middle? What's the end? It's carpentry, and that's easier to do in many ways. The poetry origins, as we talked about at the beginning of the program, are much more mysterious.
And when there are
Hard to,
fewer rules, it's harder
no
because you have
rules,
to figure out,
no
yeah.
rules.
And we're talking to Alan Appel and Dateline New Haven. Alan, we're not going to have time for a lot of poems. Let's skip ahead to
Sure.
5 minutes with New Grandchild. So we talked about how you've used poetry in the Independent. I'm so proud to publish it. To look at it, to explore the different ways we're affected by COVID-19, day-to-day life, special events, religious practice, buying food, deciding whether or not to write a note to somebody who's not your best friend and is not a stranger. And something big happened in your life, Alan,
Right.
during this COVID-19. You, for the second time, became a grandpa. And yet, I know other people who also gave birth during this time, and they're very close to me, two other people. And they were so worried about the health care, what's going to happen when they go to the hospital. You know, it all changed the way they got their pre delivery appointments with doctors and changed their planning. So, and you're very involved in your grandchild's life and your child's life. So you wrote a poem called 5 Minutes with New Grandchild in COVID-19 by Alan Appel. Hit it.
She looked in person so much smaller than in the pictures sent from the hospital, all red-faced and with features scrunched up from the questionably happy trauma. She struck us, all 7 pounds 8 ounces of her, as sausages, quite recently knitted together. Such a little thing, the roseate arm sticking out of her white swaddling, all awkward, frustrated, nothing any longer at her command. And we wanted to help, of course, and offer a token of reassurance, though even the air here is broken, as if to say, don't you be disappointed where you've landed. It's still fairly beautiful here, this strange place. We wanted to say, that's your funny nose, and it's roughly in the middle of your face. We wanted to make simple, silly observation, whatever arose, that might bring her and us some reassurance, such as outside of the hall there, you see that wavy thing, it's called a tree, with green leaves hanging on branches, as we too are hanging on here, buffeted back and forth. And no, you can't see the wind, the cold COVID north wind blowing, but oh, it's there all right, which is why we could say little of this or of the day or of the night. Beholding her in our daughter's arms in the corridor, tamping down an impulse to approach, settling only to beam and to say hello and goodbye to our new granddaughter, and now hello again from these miles away during the required 2 weeks of quarantine. We hope we succeeded through our welcoming eyes. That was our task, to communicate love through the blue and white surgical mask.
Wow. Alan Appel, his poem, 5 Minutes with New Grandchild with COVID-19. You listen to that on Dateline New Haven. So you went to the hospital while the mother and baby were still there?
No, the mother, our daughter, and her husband went into the hospital, and the husband and the mother to be had a 2-day sojourn in the hospital. So we went into their apartment and stayed with our grandson, and we greeted them 2 days later when they came back in the corridor from across the corridor as they brought the baby home. So she was worried that she might have picked up an infection in the hospital, or so she might have.
The daughter was more worried about infecting you than you
Yes.
infecting the baby.
Right.
We're all wrestling with that as grandparents. We still haven't. We Zoom with our grandson. We're tearing us apart. We can't go drive up and see him, but everyone's trying to navigate this differently, which is what is so great about Alan's poems. You know, Alan, I'm sorry I had you get ready to read so many poems because it's so interesting talking to you. We're not going to have time to read. Let's go to the last one, if that's okay. Everyone can read all of Alan Appel's poems. They're in the New Haven Independent. What you do is you find one poem of his that's up on the homepage in the extra column. They're usually a couple a day. And at the top, there's a category that says poetry. You click on that category and you'll get the 22 and counting poems that New Haven Independent staff writer Alan Appel has so beautifully written for the New Haven Independent to help us stay centered and connected during the spread of COVID-19. So I'm running out the clock a little because I asked Alan to navigate to try to find this one last poem because I thought this was an obvious ending poem. If Alan does record an album of its poems, he might write one after it's over. So then that would be the last one. But if he didn't, I think the last cut on the album would be called "We'll Know When It's Over." We'll know it's over. And you know, that's one role played by clergy people, by poets like Alan Appel, that help us see beyond the frenzy of the moment and realize that not for everybody, but for most of us, there will be another day. It might not be the same day we were used to. It will be another day. And Alan Appel wrote about when that day will come in a poem called "We'll Know It's Over."
Bear with me a second, Paul.
No rush at all. And we've been reading Alan's poems here on the air. And you can read them every day in the Independent. As I said, you go to the extra column, you'll see pandemic poetry or coronaverse, we call it, by Alan. And then when you get the poem at the top, it lists the categories. And you just press on the poetry category, you get all the poems he's written so far. 22 so far. Counting, we got a few more already in the queue.
Yeah, let me see. I'm close to this. Let's see. We'll Know When It's Over is coming right up on the old poetry guitar. And here we go. We'll know when it's over, when the customary nightmares resume, when I can pick at my nails again and not assume a portal to death has been opened. We'll know when it's over, when friends no longer back away or cross the street just to say good day. We'll know when it's over, when Zoom means just to scoot and only little kids use it playing after school. We'll know when it's over, when the next bus or train you step inside will not loom as the last ride. We'll know when it's over, when you can buy milk and eggs without that fear shaking your legs. We'll know when it's over when every bag of chips doesn't involve a mortal risk. We'll know when it's over when all the people in the lot are merely parking, not idling as they pull into the test slot. We'll know when it's over when there's the consummation of our medical dreams and they stick it in your arm, that fine, well-tested vaccine. We'll know when it's over when they declare it works, but will it only be followed by an emergency hospital visit? We'll know when it's over if there ever comes a day when we cease asking when it will be over, when we can simply breathe the air, come what may. Thank you.
Alan Appel, one of my favorite writers in the world. Esther agrees. Don't I, Stanley love it. Alan Appel's been reading some of his poems about COVID-19. I've loved them, and it's such an honor and a privilege to publish them and work with Alan Appel. Alan, you're the one reporter who's been with me since the beginning of the New Haven Independent 15 years ago.
That's right.
You've
Seems
been,
like right.
you're such a joy to work with. You're such a
Well,
great writer. And when you always rise up to the moment in a different way, because you're a poet, you're a playwright, you're a reporter, you're a human being. The way you've risen to the moment as a pandemic poet is just priceless.
well,
And
listen, Paul, I'm glad we only have a half hour on the air together because otherwise this would become an embarrassing love fest.
all right, so we don't want that. We're the news. We want to make you feel horrible. So you can feel horrible, feel good, but just know
Oh, thank
that
you
you've
so
been
much.
listening to Dateline New Haven. Thanks to Alan Appel, who is such a great writer. Keep reading his poems and keep reading and believing. I want to thank Harry Droz, our station manager, the best in the business, the miracle man behind the controls. He even did this. If you're watching on Facebook, he's done these great um, animated videos for the shows. And for those of us who at sundown tonight are observing Shavuot, hope we have a great holiday. I'm going to be trying the vegan cheesecake. I'm not sure how the crust is going to turn out. And we're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long. At WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.